virtual Wetlands Institute speaker series, and today we are going to be covering the topic of wetlands as an eco asset. So thank you for joining us today. Before we get going, I just wanted to quickly thank our sponsors. Because of their generous support, we were able to offer this event at no charge to our participants. So Environment and Climate Change Canada, the province of BC, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. I also wanted to respectfully acknowledge that we are settlers and we are hosting this webinar on the traditional unceded territory of the following nations. So this is just where BC Wildlife Federation is located, which is in Surrey. So that is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Keetsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, Tsawwassen, Stolo, and Musqueam First Nation. And this is much different than how we usually do things. So our Wetlands Institute is traditionally an intensive 7-day hands-on workshop, which obviously was not going to happen this year around, thanks to all the changes that are happening globally. So this hands-on workshop is meant to educate participants about wetland stewardship, restoration, and construction. It includes in-the-field learning, practicing up-to-date field techniques, and gaining practical experience restoring or enhancing at least one wetland. We usually do have limited seats, so participants need to apply to attend, and they must apply with a wetland-related project, whether that be restoration, protection, enhancement, or an educational project. Thanks to our sponsors, this workshop is usually free of charge to BC residents, which we valued at over $1,000. And participants also can receive support up to 3 years post-workshop. So the reason why I'm explaining this is we are hoping to introduce or reintroduce an in-person workshop next year for the Wetlands Institute. We will be hosting it in a hybridized version. So a lot of the classroom portions will be held virtually, and then our outside portions will be hosted with COVID-19 procedures. So keep your eyes on that. Hopefully you signed up for a mailing list, so you'll be first to know when our Wetlands Institute 2021 opens up, and you can apply for a spot. Just a quick note on setting you up for success. So we are in Zoom webinar. If you have any problems with Zoom whatsoever, please ask the question in the chat button. So the chat icon is used only for technical questions regarding Zoom. If you have a question for the guest speaker, please use the Q&A button. We will not be answering questions out of the chat, only the Q&A. So Cindy is going to be watching the Q&A button for questions that you have for either Rob or Michelle. And we will be saving all of your questions for the end of the presentation of each speaker. I just want to quickly introduce our guest speakers. So first thing, we have Rob Lawrence, who is the environmental planner with the city of Nanaimo. Within this role, Rob has worked on environmental policy and program development application reviews, and park restoration planning. So Rob has previously worked as the city parks and open space planner, working on several park plans and park operation projects. Rob also acts as city representative on the Buttertubs Marsh Conservation Area Management Committee. So Rob will be joining us from 9 to about 10, including question and answer period. And then Michelle Molnar is going to be joining us after that. She might be joining us a little early, but she'll be presenting from 10 o'clock on. And Michelle is the technical director of the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, as well as the environmental economist and policy analyst at the David Suzuki Foundation. So her work focuses on the conservation of natural capital using various tools of ecological economics, policy analysis, and public outreach. She leads MNAI's technical team and has worked with over 20 communities to apply their framework. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Rob, and go ahead, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Alyssa. Appreciate it very
welcome.
much. Now I'm going to try and find my presentation quickly here. I'm just digging for it right now, so bear with me. Seems to be a problem on my end, perhaps. I'm not sure. Now I see it. Thanks, guys. All right, so you should be able to see the screen now. I'll get started. All right, so thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, Cindy Lou, for inviting me. And I really appreciate the time to kind of share some of the City of Nanaimo's experience on municipal natural asset work. And I know this has been going on across the country, and I know that'll get looked at a little bit further with Michelle's presentation, kind of the broad view. But for this presentation, it's more of a focus on the pilot study itself. And I'm going to give a bit of a, well, quickly orient us on where Nanaimo is for those who may not know, but I think most people do, but a little bit of background on the Buttertubs Marsh Conservation Management Area. And then kind of a deeper dive into the natural asset pilot study, a little bit of the history on how it came about, some of the goals and modeled scenarios and results. And then we'll step back to look at some of the challenges and opportunities the city had after the pilot study around municipal asset planning, and kind of a roadmap about where we see ourselves going on doing further work and implementing what we discovered during the study. So really quick, Nanaimo, for those who don't know, on the east coast of Vancouver Island, second largest urban center on the island, just under 100,000 population. I would say a fair bit of significant parkland, a little under 1,400 hectares of parkland, and 70% of that is zoned as natural area. So there's a fair bit of opportunity for the public to have close access to a wide variety of ecosystems, and whether that's marine foreshores or some of the many water courses and streams and rivers that travel through the city. In the photograph on the left, you can see Newcastle Island, Shiatsen, which is a provincial park, and as with Nanaimo, part of the traditional territory of the Nanaimo people. So I guess for us to kind of orient ourselves, the way the city kind of looked at natural assets, and this was with the input and work with Michelle, and I'm sure she'll speak to it much further. We really kind of took direction and inspiration from the town of Gibsons and some of the early work that they did around developing a kind of a protocol around natural assets, and their definition, features in a natural environment to provide and support equivalent engineering municipal services, I think kind of resonated with not just the planning staff, but I think engineering and some of the other departments as something that made a lot of sense, because for many of us, I think we understand the ecological services and values that many of our natural features have, but it's always been kind of seen as an externality, something that is just there from a finance perspective or even from an engineering perspective for many years. It's kind of an outlier to maybe a hard or an engineered asset, but trying to see it more as a system where we integrate these much more effectively and appreciate the values, not just from an environmental perspective, but also as a community amenity and part of the overall infrastructure, I think is something that's relatively new and really just evolving. So, and that's kind of what this pilot project was about, excuse me, was to try to explore the concept and develop a way of kind of developing a rationale so that other departments and other staff across the city, but also elsewhere in other communities, could better understand what the value of natural assets are to the city as part of that overall infrastructure that we typically manage, whether that's water or sewer or storm services. And I do like the list, the short list on the multiple advantages. And I think this makes sense in a lot of ways. Being a natural asset, the depreciation costs are not there. There's no upfront replacement costs. It's kind of an ongoing feature that can, if it's well integrated and well designed with other infrastructure, whether that's, well, typically storm, but even an urban forest canopy provides some services, particularly when you're looking at climate change and as we try to adapt as communities to changing climates. I think these natural features are going to become much more important, obviously. So just to step back to when this began, it was 2017. We were approached by the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, which was a kind of an umbrella organization that was working through, I believe, University of Ottawa. Michelle might correct me on that, but they were looking at coordinating a national project with 5 communities, and the other 4 being District of West Vancouver, Grand Forks, BC, Region of Peel, and Town of Oakville. And each was asked to kind of look at the pilot for 2 kind of to answer or assess 2 questions. So assess the condition of a natural asset within each city and the municipal services it provides, and determine the cost of the natural asset value and compare as to an engineered alternative. That was the challenge, and I think each community took a different approach and again went to different scales on how to address the question. But for us, our focus was on the Buttertubs Marsh complex. And just for a little orientation, it's not an overall city map you're looking at, but this is the downtown area. And my earlier slide where I pointed out Newcastle or Shiatsen, this is that island there. But there's a major waterway called the Millstone that travels from just north of downtown to the west and out of the city boundaries into the regional district. And just to the north of that, it crosses the Buttertubs Marsh area, which is this site here, which is about a 55-hectare conservation area. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of parks, city parks, regional parks, also managed by the Nature Trust of BC elsewhere in the city as well. So on a little closer scale, a little bit of the history maybe on the Buttertubs conservation area. It has quite a history. It's originally, I guess since when settlers first came to Nanaimo, it was really kind of looked at as farmland for the coal mining community there, and a lot of the low marshlands that were naturally here just along the Millstone River were drained and for farming activity, and that continued on until I think just around the turn of the century for the 20th century. And then the military during World War II turned it over into a tank training area. So actually this area was severely damaged, trashed, to be honest, with military vehicles and military activity and housing troops, I believe it's at one point. Over time, it shifted back to farming after the war. And in 1976, through some federal grant money, the eastern half of the marsh was purchased for conservation reasons and secured through the province of British Columbia, and eventually managed through the Nature Trust of British Columbia. The western half remained in private hands until actually quite recently, until 2013, when it was purchased by the city and is now being co-managed with Ducks Unlimited, who have a co-management agreement and often do yearly inspections just to ensure the natural values of the property are maintained by the city. All 55 hectares are part of a conservation management area I mentioned, and since then obviously there's been other properties either acquired by the city or acquired by the Nature Trust and attached to the property. It's managed through a committee that oversees a management plan that's reviewed every 5 years. And this is just one of the maps we've used just to kind of identify high level biological kind of the polygons for restoration purposes. But part of the purpose of this is just to kind of coordinate our restoration activities, and we do work with local naturalists and a number of residents and volunteers through the park system that participate and work with the city and with the Nature Trust on tree planting work, on some invasive species control, and the Vancouver Island University, whose campus is just off the map here to the south. They manage a bird banding station and do inventory work on the West Marsh. Public access wise, there is a circular trail that goes around the East Marsh primarily. There are no trails or obvious access points to the West Marsh, so it makes a very special green space for wildlife and for research. So typically the university will do studies on this side. Most of the public will just access and do the trail circuits, and there's an old miner's cottage to the south that's provided for space to have a nature interpretation or be a bit of a base for the local naturalist group to provide a bit of an outreach center. So I think I've touched a little bit about the why in it earlier, but when we chose Buttertubs, I think it was really important that we had this strong partnership for many years with the Nature Trust, with the province, and with Ducks Unlimited. And there was a long legacy of data and restoration work that had been done on the property. So we felt it was a good choice to do the pilot study since there was that information already available. And there was a strong interest to kind of better understand how we can manage this in the future and work toward getting a kind of an ongoing sustainable budget for the maintenance work that we identified in the management plan. So, because like many communities, it's a struggle to find resources to do some of the restoration work. And while there's external funding we can apply to, if there's a way to include it or incorporate it into city budgets and rationalize it by recognizing it as part of our storm infrastructure, then it was an opportunity worth exploring from our perspective. So really, it was there was a few things we did as part of the study. There was a kind of an overall beneficiary assessment done. What are the natural features? What are the endangered species in the property? What do we know about the habitat values on the property, and how is this connected with the surrounding communities, and how do they value this wetland as a feature people just love to go and visit and appreciate nature and learn about the natural world in close proximity to where they live. I think on another part of this, we needed to have a better understanding of the hydrology and how this wetland integrates with the surrounding storm systems and mitigates the impacts and flows of the Millstone River. While the system as it currently exists, the hard engineered system, the storm system, functions well. Understanding climate change and the potential impact of extreme storm events in the future, we realize there's going to be a need to have a reassessment of existing storm systems and potential high costs for doing replacements of some of these hard assets. If there was a way of better understanding how wetlands can mitigate those extreme rain events and potential flooding, I think that can build a case for the value of trying to retain these and incorporate them better into a storm system and to provide a budget, a reasonable budget to maintain them for those natural features that they provide. So as part of all that, a stormwater management model was developed, and a series of scenarios were developed based on the flows entering the system, primarily from the storm catchment area, but I'll get into that in a second. So the models, the scenarios we decided to focus on was basically first a baseline. So what are the existing conditions based within the catchment areas that we defined, and the map on the right outlines 3 catchment areas that we defined that the storm systems or the storm lines feed into the wetland. There are 2 outlet points. This one's actually more toward the north here, so I think that's just for illustrative purposes, but there is a weir feature here where there's a line that enters the river here. You should know too that the East Marsh is actually, the water level is, I believe it's 1.5 meters higher than the West Marsh. There is a berm that bisects the wetland. There is a water main that was installed there in 1976 that does cut the marsh in half. So one side question we had was there any value in looking at some point in the future, opening up the berm to allow direct flow back and forth between the West and the East Marsh? But I can get into that a little bit later. But as it was now, there was this berm. There is a weir here, so there was a higher water level on the east and the west side of the marsh. But both sides do get influenced during winter high flows from the Millstone River, and obviously from higher flows coming from the storm system from the different catchment areas. Anyway, with all that said, back to the models. So there was a baseline just to kind of look at what are the existing conditions, and then there was then we wanted to kind of look at what would be the change in the efficiencies of if, for example, the marsh was removed and replaced with an open grass field, or moved and replaced with a single family development. So obviously more pervious and impervious changes to the marsh, and then and on top of that, just to add just some scenarios that looked at major storm events, a 1 in 100 year and a 1 in 200 year, just to get a better sense of the impacts that climate change would have during these scenarios. So so basically the marsh as it is, as a grassed field and as a subdivision, how would stormwater be impacted by those changes to the landscape? And again, this was trying to get toward a point where we could understand the actual value in dollars for what the marsh does naturally. And we did that through looking at the surface area of the water itself on the east and the west side, and the water depth and the amount of flow coming on and off the marsh through a number of data loggers that were set up around the periphery and at the entry points from the storm lines. And a cost estimate for the changes in land use to an engineered scenario, whether that was the subdivision or to replace it with an engineered system. Actually, that's what I should be saying, at 150 per cubic meter. Anyway, the results led to actually a significant value for the marsh as it exists for both east and west side. So during a historic 100-year flow, the value of the marsh is easily in the millions, and double the value for just what it does normally in its current flows when climate change is factored. So it was a realization that the replacement value for the marsh would be extremely significant to find if we decided on an engineered solution to what the marsh does naturally now. And it would even become more valuable as we look at increasing high rain events in the future over the next 100 years. But just to be clear, there were limitations to the modeling that we did do. These were conservative estimates. They did not include the cost of the property itself. So it was just looking at the replacement value of the marsh's storage and retention value if it was replaced with an engineered system. And it only looked at runoff coming from the storm systems, not looking at the millstone, the influence from the millstone itself. And the reason for that was cost. There wasn't budget to do like a watershed management study or a watershed hydrology study. So we had to put that aside and focus more specifically on the marsh and how it is impacted and influences the storm water entering the system before it goes into the river. And it didn't include, it was only dynamic storage, it was also measuring too. So looking at a specific event, not total storage from maybe a succession of storm events that would, that the marsh would still capture and retain during like high flows during the winter, say. So, but the estimate was it was roughly 4 times the dynamic storage for that. So definitely significant savings and a significant value was identified as part of this study. And I think that was an eye opener for a lot of people. I don't think, honestly, many people had any idea what the value of what the marsh does was really kind of contemplated. But when they saw those figures, I think it raised a few eyebrows, and people were, well, particularly on the finance side and engineering within the city, I think they were surprised by the results. So, but that's a good thing. I think that was really the purpose of the whole exercise was to really kind of quantify that value in a way that you know, other professions can appreciate. I did say we did a beneficiary consideration assessment as well, and that was again looking at its value as a ecological assets for habitat, for nature appreciation from the public, to provide connectivity between neighborhoods, but also with habitat further up and down the river itself. So as a habitat corridor and a bit of a refuge. And I think that was illustrated quite strongly by looking at the results from VIU's bird study. So there was definitely some high numbers in the West Marsh and from migrating birds and quite a wide variety as well. So that was an interesting result. And I've touched on this a few times around climate resiliency. Definitely it's mitigating effects on high flows, whether it's the storm system, but obviously it does have an impact on the river itself, and that helps mitigate any kind of flooding impacts downstream. But also carbon sequestration. There is some studies and there is some interest in looking at how wetlands absorb carbon and can play that role, especially in the future as we kind of go forward. So we're looking at doing some further studies in that regard, but it's definitely an area of interest for us to look at as part of the management committee. And obviously, last but not least, the water quality value of what wetlands do to try and filter and clean water as it passes from those storm outlets into the river itself for fish habitat and fish values. So I mentioned a couple of other beneficiary options that we explored. I know, well, definitely one thing that we're looking at right now is one of the legacies of all the disturbance and heady use of the past in the marsh area is an extremely high variety of invasive species that you can find in the marsh itself. There are pockets of some fairly good habitat, and there are endangered species such as western painted turtle that are found in the marsh, but there is a wide range of invasive species as well that need to be addressed and managed for. And one project I can see us working on in the near future is a removal of some of the older growth, quote unquote, English Hawthorn, and trying to return it, particularly in the upper wetland pockets or upper highland pockets on the east side along here primarily, and replacing the hawthorn and returning it to a more mixed natural forest over time. So that's something we're looking at starting in the spring and in this winter actually. We did look into a removal of a portion of the berm from the East to West Marsh, but as I mentioned earlier, the water levels are higher on the east, and by opening the berm up, it would actually have quite a negative impact on habitat values on the east. And because of the western painted turtle habitat on the east, particularly on the east side, we felt that wasn't a direction we wanted to go. So that project more or less was put aside. We're still looking at developing or looking at side channel opportunities, and there are some historic agricultural ditches on the west side that do drain the marsh, and there's some question about whether or not that might be something we could or should close off to create more of a deeper open water habitat on this side. That's something that's still being looked at. And but typically during the winter time, the flows, the river actually goes across the screen here from, in this little image anyways, from the left to the right, and the water during the winter time we usually cut across, build up in here. If the water is high enough and the flows are strong enough, it'll go over the dike at a low point that has been designed for that purpose so that it can flow into the east side. But typically it'll go out these old agricultural ditches or through the weir system there. Anyway, the side channel project still being looked at, and for fish habitat, and that would be more on the west side, and potentially as a refuge for during those high flows in the main river channel. So some of the current challenges and opportunities. So after the study, we had, I mean, there was a fair bit of consultation and presentation internally. We did have a core team with Michelle and her staff, and some key staff from planning, engineering, and the finance department. And there was often a little, while there was, the study I think was effective in relating the economic value, there was still lots of questions about what would the mechanics of how we could basically budget for the wetlands in a kind of an annual city budget. And there were some concerns on the finance side from, basically the traditional way city budgets are put together and designed. There was kind of a concern about how we could actually include a natural asset, which from their perspective was still kind of seen as an externality, even though this study definitely kind of showed the value, the financial value of what this wetland does. And it was definitely cost effective when you looked at what you would have to do from an engineered solution versus what the wetland does just to maintain it and maybe to do continued restoration. It was definitely a lower cost, but it was still kind of a back and forth discussion around that. I think as well is the issue around staff capacity. Depending on the size of the community and the number of staff, there's so many different competing interests and projects and initiatives that maintain the focus to finish the work that we started, and to carry on with implementation was a difficult thing. Other priorities, other time crunches for issues like developing our climate resiliency plan, our updating our existing climate mitigation plan kind of took pressing need over the environment staff, and we had to kind of shift focus and get onto that. And that kind of leads to my third point about a little bit about the politics. Definitely council direction and council priorities can shift depending on the election cycle. So while with one council you can have a lot of support and movement on a lot of environmental issues, the priorities can change depending on what the most important issue to address is. And lately, for many communities, it's been looking at the climate emergency declarations, and Nanaimo's done that like many other communities, and coming up with an effective plan to meet the expectation of council today. So that took time and effort away from continuing on with projects like the Natural Asset Initiative, but it's still there. It's still something we can work our way back, but I know that resourcing is one of the things that kind of delayed our progress on this effort. So this is my last slide, and it's just kind of a bit of a roadmap on where we see ourselves going. The good news is, despite all the challenges, the natural asset strategy was added to the council strategic plan, so it's still recognized as a priority, and to further develop a strategy and a complete asset inventory on city-owned properties. I think our focus will mostly be on wetlands to begin, but I know over time urban forestry will be another component, and marine foreshore areas, what we'll be looking at. Excuse me. Particularly when you're looking at the potential impacts of sea level rise. So any kind of green shoring opportunities that we could look at is something that we might consider as part of the inventory. We began flow monitoring and within Buttertubs Marsh, and we're going to continue doing that and collecting flow data just to improve our hydrological model that we did develop, and to have better data available for any kind of follow-up work, and whether that's with the Nature Trust or with the asset, the national or the natural asset work that we're going to do later on. And we've sorry guys, and we've continued to develop local partnerships, and that's been an interesting kind of development too, because there is another group, the Partnership for Water Sustainability, which is taking a slightly different approach around natural assets, focusing on ecological accounting. And they're working with us and the regional districts on a broader Millstone River ecological accounting pilot study. So that work has just begun, and hopefully that will complement the work done in Buttertubs and Marsh, and again add kind of weight to the argument about the values of wetlands and how they are important features as part of river and riparian ecosystems within the region. And obviously, just keeping our council informed as we kind of move forward with each of these steps, and then ensuring that there's we have budget to continue on with the work that we've kind of laid out in front of us. So that was a bit of quite a run, but I want to thank you for your time. And at this point, maybe I'll just kind of pass it back to Alyssa, and let's see if there's any questions or comments, and yeah, let's go from there.
Great, thank you, Rob. That was super informative. I do see there's a couple questions in the Q&A chat button. So Cindy, if you want to ask them on the participants' behalf.
Yeah, for sure. First one I have from Sarah Town. She said, hi from North Vancouver. Is
Hello.
the full storm water management study available for the public to access? I'm interested in referencing it when advocating for wetland protection in my own community.
Yeah, yes, it is. Actually, Alyssa, I could give you the city website. It's actually all on the city webpage, and you could probably just Google City Nanaimo Natural Asset, and you'll find the study. And but if not, I can send a link. Yeah, so it is publicly available.
Sure, yeah, Rob, if you want to send a link to me, because we are going to be sending out a post-webinar email with the link to this recording, so we can add that link to that email.
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you so much. Second, I have Mark. It's great to maintain differing habitats between the east and west. I wonder if you look at the effect of the water holding, i.e. flood mitigation ability of the entire complex if the Bern was removed.
Yes, I mean, I think that's what kind of stopped us was when we looked at opening the berm, and obviously considering the depth of the water main and all this needed to be taken into consideration. So there's only so far we could probably open up that berm in any case. And again, because of the higher water level in the east, we realized the value of maintaining that as is, as a kind of a higher open water habitat all year round. Kind of outshone the value of opening it up, at least at this point. We might try and do some other work, as I was mentioning, to close off the agricultural ditches and create more open water habitat on the west side. But because of our knowledge of some of the endangered species, like the western painted turtle, that frequent primarily the east side, we didn't want to kind of go too far down a road where that would impact that population. So it's a balancing act, and I think we're kind of living with the legacy of the choices that were made and a lot of the impacts, obviously, that were done to this wetland area. But we're trying to address it and do it in a just very careful, thoughtful way.
Perfect, thank you so much. And next I have from Kyle, what engineer strategies were discussed when assessing the flood mitigation comparisons?
Do you have anything in specific? Just so you want to, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it was a modeling study. We were looking at the pipe sizing of the storm system that we had in the catchment areas, and actually the focus of the study was really to try to come up with a financial value of the wetland itself and what the replacement value was. And it was a very high level estimate that the consultant put together, but yeah, it didn't go into any specific engineering strategy other than that. So unless you had something specific you were thinking of, you want to say.
Okay, yeah, we can see if Cal have any follow-up, but we do have other questions as well from Michael. Sure. How can the value of wetlands best be explained and promoted to landowners?
I guess it depends where the landowner is, but I think there's I guess there's always the concern about flooding on private property, particularly adjoining wetlands, and that's always kind of a bone of contention for some. I think there needs to be, and I guess this study helps illustrate that it's not about the flooding. It's understanding how much this is acting as a bit of a sponge to hold back water and prevent greater impact potentially downstream and to adjoining properties. And while there is seasonal high and low levels that adjoining private properties there will be an impact to that. And Buttertubs is unique because it's primarily been put aside for conservation and it's owned by the city, but other wetlands on private properties, that's often a concern about the level of flooding and impact, say, to farming activity and such, and I understand that. But I think by trying to communicate the lessons learned from this study, I think there could be some better appreciation about the financial value and the financial savings that could be had overall. But I think that work still needs to be done. And maybe Michelle can add to this, and maybe there's some further work that's been done elsewhere that can help with that. But that's how I see it anyways.
Thank you so much. And now we did hear back from Kyle. He said nothing specific regards to the engineering strategy, but thank you for the answer.
Kyle, have a look at the study. Urban Systems was the consultant we hired, and perhaps some of your answers might be in the study itself, but I'll send the link out.
Thank you so much. Next, I have a question. It sounds like studying the financial benefits of Buttertubs Marsh help persuade other municipal professionals and council members to continue the protection of the marsh. From a municipal government perspective, do you think studying the psychological benefits that the marsh has for the community, i.e. through a survey, for example, would hold any weight for council or government professionals? Or is it mainly the cost that hold the weight?
Well, I guess it depends on the perspective of the person you're asking about. I guess for a councillor, he's looking at his voters, the residents of the community, and I think things like understanding how people's perceptions and feelings about having these features in the community can be broader than just simply looking at the financial aspect. I think if you're looking at it from an engineering perspective, I think having those numbers and trying to have that argument more in line with how they look at engineering assets, you kind of just need to reframe the argument to kind of adjust to communicate that message better. it's funny because you mentioned surveying, because the ecological accounting pilot that I mentioned earlier that the Partnership for Water Sustainability in the Regional District are working on, that's one of the pieces that they're looking at, is kind of more of an in-depth survey of the residents who live along the millstone, as well as looking at the land values and trying to account for basically land assessment value in relation to the river, as well as the sense of place, the perception people have about living next to a river, and how they kind of equate the value of living next to a natural area like that, and trying to kind of have the data side by side. I mean, the study is just still in play, so we'll see what the results look like at the end, but it's just another perspective, another approach that might yield some interesting results.
Thanks so much. And next we have a question from Lisa. How difficult was it to sell the importance of this study and the importance of wetlands to the council? Do you foresee issues as council changes over the years?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, it will. I think we're fortunate now. We have a very motivated and interested council that are looking at a number of environmental topics as a priority, and I think climate resiliency, climate mitigation is top of mind for them. But I think looking at natural assets as a solution and trying to blend that into the messaging as part of the response to address climate adaptation, I think is a good way to look at this. I think it's just a matter of just doing the homework and preparing the case and working with partners like the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative or Partnership for Water Sustainability, and getting that information together. I think will kind of help sell the importance of doing this work. But as I say, councils do change and perspectives change, and I think there's a lot of concern about costs, and particularly from the development community here. And I think residents are also feeling the squeeze on taxes. So I think we just need to do a better job of understanding what the value is and why we need to make the investments that we do make, whether that's an engineered solution or protecting and restoring a wetland, and always keeping that in mind, that at the end of the day, I think the councillors need to be able to provide that information to their constituents in a kind of a clear, concise way. And I think this is a way to do this. I know on an emotional level, on a personal level, for many, having a wetland, having a place like this is special, and it helps with their mental health, helps with their community well-being. But I think having the numbers, having the financial costs kind of laid out, helps the councillors rationalize any kind of expense or expenditure to put a budget line item to restore and maintain this wetland and support what it does naturally as part of a greater storm engineering system. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a bit of a ramble.
No, I think that was great. It's good to see the direction there as well. Next we have from Erin. She's also from City of Delta. Will you be looking at getting carbon credit options for restoration or protection work and sequestration that can happen with healthy wetlands?
I'm interested in that. I'd be happy to hear more about it. I think that's a good approach, but we haven't done too much homework on that yet. So Erin, if there's anything you can share with myself, I'd be keen to hear more. But I guess the short answer right now is no, but I'm definitely open to it.
Thank you. I don't have any more open questions here. And maybe you can give a couple more moments if anyone wants to type in the last questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alyssa, if you want, I can hang in there, and if you want to switch to Michelle, and I can still take questions later if that's useful. So
sure, if you're open to that, Rob, that would be great.
That's fine.
Awesome. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, I can introduce Michelle. She joined us during your presentation. So if you just go to the bottom of this screen, perfect.
I think it's done now.
Awesome, great. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us. So I did give a quick introduction of you before you were here, so everybody knows who you are. So let's open up the floor for yourself and get underway with your presentation. And then during the Q&A period, if anybody has any additional questions for Rob, if you could just identify in your question that they are for Rob, we can answer all questions for each presenter accordingly.
Okay, sounds good. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. And my thanks to the BC Wildlife Federation for the invitation to speak today. So I've been asked to speak today on the value of wetlands, the economic tools that are available to demonstrate their value, and where some of the gaps are. So just before I dive in, I thought I should give a little bit of my background. I'm a classically trained economist, but I also have graduate training in philosophy as well as public policy. So for me, I really wanted to use this combination of economics, logic, and policy to draw out the deficiencies of our current economic system, to really highlight the blind spots related to nature. So fast forward 20 years, and I've had the fortune to work with groups like Environment Canada, the Canadian Municipality for Ecological Economics, the David Suzuki Foundation, and the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative to really explore just that. So I'm hoping to impart some of the lessons that I've learned along the way, and also to highlight the work that still remains to be done. So I thought I'd start with a bit of the argument for valuing nature. Now, while the terms ecosystem services and natural capital are relatively new still, the concept certainly is not. These concepts really refer to the reality that humanity and nature are intricately connected. We are ultimately bound by and reliant upon natural systems. So as individual biological beings, we depend on nature for many life-sustaining and life-affirming processes. So we depend upon vegetation to clean the air that we breathe. We depend upon healthy soils to grow the food that nourishes us. And we depend upon clean water to hydrate us and maintain healthy functioning of our bodies. Now, as social beings, we depend upon the minerals and the raw materials of nature to fuel our economies. And it's in nature that our culture finds its roots and really its sense of place. So scientists and economists refer to this vast collection of benefits provided by nature as ecosystem services, which all flow from healthy ecosystems. Now, wetlands, where land meets water, are particularly important and valuable ecosystems that provide a range of benefits. And the image on the right-hand side here just starts to get at some of those benefits, and I'll discuss them a little more in a little bit. So what happens when we don't value nature? So conventional economics has largely been detached from the environmental sciences. This discipline of economics that's really devoted to the allocation of scarce resources has remained silent about the natural foundation of production and the biophysical limits to growth. So for instance, although ecosystems assimilate the waste byproducts of economic production, there are generally no agreed upon rules or mechanisms to ensure that emissions do not exceed the capacity of ecosystems to process that waste. So while this position was likely justifiable in the early days of the discipline of economics, at that time nature appeared inexhaustible. Today we're really experiencing increasing scarcity with respect to the supply of natural resources. And that's really indicating that nature has become a topic ripe for economic consideration. Now, today, everyone from farmers and fishermen to bankers and financiers are waking up to two important facts. One, we depend on nature in far more complex ways than we knew. And secondly, nature is not inexhaustible. Little did we know that the green revolution in agriculture would result in depleted soils and local health impacts associated with insecticides, or that we could deplete a once abundant fish population such as North Atlantic cod. And today, bankers and insurers are growing increasingly concerned about costs related to extreme weather events, which threaten to disrupt supply chains and commodity prices. So despite this growing awareness about the importance of intact, healthy ecosystems, as well as commitments by various levels of government to reduce biodiversity loss, we see ecosystems continuing to be mismanaged, misunderstood, and sometimes destroyed. Now, there's many reasons for the gap between what we want and what we have, but a key underlying reason is our economic frameworks fail to value biodiversity or the conservation of ecosystems. Really, with very few exceptions, there's little financial reward for conserving nature, nor much penalty for destroying it. So in short, nature is really overused and undervalued. Now, if you look at wetlands in particular, they are one of the most impacted ecosystems. In southern Ontario, approximately 70% of wetlands have been lost. In Alberta, that figure is about 65%. And in parts of BC, it ranges anywhere between 70 and 85%. Regardless of that, most areas of our country still do not have a no net loss policy for wetlands. So why value nature? So I think one of the first points I should really make is that while no valuation can really give you a comprehensive value of nature in the sense of being able to put a price tag on a tree or a wetland, what you can do is value the services provided by nature. And the good news is that methodologies to do so have really progressed. So within the past couple of decades, considerable progress has really been made to systematically link functioning ecosystems with human well-being. So work completed by a range of academics, folks like de Groot and Costanza, as well as groups like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. They've marked really key advancements in this work. And although all of us recognize that the linkages between functions and human well-being are a simplification of reality, and definitely there's further research and refinements to be done, they have provided an accepted conceptual framework for valuing nature services. So ultimately, by identifying and placing a value on the services sustained by ecosystems, these connections between people and the environment are really brought out into the open. Now, I don't want to overstate the case, however, so I've added a few important caveats here. One is that our knowledge of the functions, and particularly the interconnections of nature, is limited, and that will be reflected in valuations. So just as an example of our level of knowledge, we didn't know much about the benefits of the ozone layer until we realized there was a hole in it in the mid-1980s. Secondly, there may be values that are really hard to monetize or that you don't want an economist to monetize. I'm going to dig into a few examples in a little bit, But the point I want to make here is that even if you don't want to value particular services, let's say the intrinsic value of a species, you may be able to calculate the costs we face if certain services are lost. And those costs can really inform decision making. Oops. Okay, so that just gets me to the agenda. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about the MNAI approach, which is one approach to valuing ecosystem services. I'll talk about some of the wetland services that we assessed. So what were the services we were looking at and what did the values look like? And then I'll step back and talk about kind of the range of methodologies that are really available for completing evaluation. I'll give some key considerations that should be made when you're choosing evaluation approach. I'll talk about some of the gaps and some of the research needs, and then close with other considerations. Okay, so the story of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative really started with a small BC community, Gibsons, just outside of Vancouver in Howe Sound. And their approach to really address a common problem that local governments across Canada face. So like most local governments, the small town of Gibsons was facing a fairly significant problem. Their infrastructure was aging and their budgets were shrinking. So this is a small town of approximately 4,000 people, and they had to figure out how they could continue providing essential services to their residents and their businesses. Now in 2016, they were just kind of wrapping up their first go at asset management, and they made some important realizations. They realized that some of their most essential services were being provided by natural systems in their community. And in particular, they realized their local aquifer was providing the vast majority of the town with clean drinking water, and all for free. So free is great, but it led to a number of questions. Questions like, what do we know about the aquifer? How are we protecting it so it lasts? How do our municipal decisions affect that aquifer? And what are we going to do to protect the water supply that it provides? So the answers to these questions were unsettling because they were virtually nothing. So they had very limited knowledge about the aquifer, and they had no money allocated to monitor, maintain, protect, or manage it. Yet, of course, everyone knew it was valuable and that replacing it with a new treatment plant would be very expensive and time-consuming. So in 2016, Gibson started looking deeper into their aquifer and their other natural assets. What they discovered was the aquifer was acting as a natural underground reservoir that holds and provides groundwater to their wells and their springs. In fact, water from the aquifer is so pure that it meets health standards without any chemical treatment. And they also discovered that their creeks and ponds were storing and filtering stormwater runoff at a fraction of the cost of an engineered asset. So the work with Gibsons really led to the creation of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, where we're really refining, replicating, and scaling up the Gibsons example in communities across Canada, as well as tackling some of the policy and normative barriers that local governments face in attempting to better manage their natural assets. So we provide scientific, economic, and engineering expertise to support local governments in identifying, valuing, and accounting for natural assets in both their financial planning and asset management processes. Our approach really aligns and is informed by Asset Management BC's framework. So that's based on current international best practices, as well as best practices that have been developed and endorsed by local government practitioners. But essentially, our approach follows the asset management framework by answering some very standard questions for natural assets. So questions like, what is your inventory of natural assets? What is their condition and can it be improved? What level of service are they providing? What is its value? How will it respond to changes in demand, whether that's climate change or maybe intensified development? And how will local governments maintain it over time? So to answer these questions, we bring multidisciplinary teams to complete place-based modeling and economic analysis. So at this time, we've worked with about 20 communities across Canada. I think with each community we work with, we have the benefit of refining our approach. And I'm just going to focus in today on some of the projects that really looked at wetlands. So here's 6 examples of projects that we've done where we've looked at wetlands. And of course, Rob gave a great overview of a 7th. So as you will see, we really focus on stormwater services, and I'm going to address those values today. We're also starting to do some work on coastal assets, so really looking at the role of natural assets on the coast to mitigate storm surge and coastal erosion, and of course, coastal wetlands are really important there too, but I'm just going to focus on the stormwater piece today. So in Gibson's, the first project we really completed, we assessed the values of ponds within White Tower Park to retain stormwater and to reduce flood peaks during large storm events. And there we found the value of those services ranged from 3.5 to 4 million. In the District of West Vancouver, we looked at a buried stream and assessed the stormwater values associated with daylighting it. So here we looked at stormwater conveyance, but also what would be the costs to restore and enhance habitat for coho salmon and cutthroat trout. And there, the value of those services were approximately $330,000. In the region of Peel, we actually looked at 3 different classes of wetlands. So really started digging into wetlands, looked at polystrene, isolated, and riverine wetlands, and a range of benefits. So what are their values to attenuate peak flows, to enhance water quality, and provide stormwater retention? And because we looked at these values across quite a large watershed, you'll see the values range from about 240 to 260 million. In the town of Oakville, we looked at a small remnant stream and its ability to attenuate peak flows, to enhance water quality, and to provide infiltration. And the value for that was 1.2 to 1.4 million. In the district of Sparwood, in the Kootenays of BC, we looked at a small natural pond and its ability to provide stormwater retention and enhance water quality going into the Elk River. And that small pond was valued at about 200,000. And then lastly, in the town of Riverview in New Brunswick, we looked at 4 wetlands that were contained within a greenfield development site and looked at their ability to store and retain stormwater runoff, looked at volume and peak flow reduction as well. And they were valued at 1.4 to $2.3 million.
Sorry, Michelle, I think I just have a question that I think is directly related to this slide. If
Sure.
you don't mind, just a question if the value of these services are per annum.
No, these are almost like the capital value. So this is the value if you were to need to replace the services with built infrastructure, which you wouldn't be doing every year. So this is definitely the one time. We also look at, which would be more of a per annum economic calculation for operating and maintenance costs, as well as monitoring.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I should also mention that we look at a wide range of co-benefits, but we often address them qualitatively. So this is just, some of the co-benefits we've looked at. How we often go about that is by really working with the community to identify those core co-benefits that are of importance to the community and that are present in the community. We generally will provide a bit of an assessment that might include a bit on the latest research related to that service. We generally look at the local context, so who is benefiting from these services, how are they captured in policy, maybe what economic community contributions they make to the community, and then often provide recommendations if desired for how to capture these in decision making. What I should also say is we have started to value co-benefits in our watershed studies, one of which is on Vancouver Island, the Comox Valley Regional District. But we do so without modeling. So the resulting values are not tied to measured level of services in the same way that the stormwater values I gave you are. Really, the idea is to give kind of that wider, broader picture of the benefits that are being provided by natural assets. But it does need to be noted that the level of accuracy probably is reduced, so it's more of a order of magnitude estimate. Okay. So I'm going to dig into some of the methodologies and hopefully I keep everyone here while I'm going through this. I feel like it's fairly academic. So there are a range of accepted methodologies for valuing ecosystem services. So I'm going to briefly do my best to describe each of them, and then I'll speak to what I see as the most important considerations when choosing which method to use. So I'm going to start with the boxes on the left, market valuation. And market valuation is really generally considered the gold standard. Now, because only a subset of ecosystem services are recognized in markets directly, things like agricultural products, but many more are not, particularly many of the regulating services that we all depend on. So when you're not able to use direct market prices, avoided damages is one approach. And this assumes that the value of ecosystem services can be measured by calculating the damages that would occur if the ecosystem service were lost. So this is the approach that MNAI takes. We use biophysical models to determine the capacity of ecosystems to supply stormwater services. Rob mentioned using EPA swim models. We try to use models that the engineers and communities are familiar with and are already using. Once we understand those levels of capacity, we then ask if the same level of capacity had to be replaced with built infrastructure, what would that cost? So this is the avoided cost or replacement cost of natural infrastructure. It's really place-based, which is attractive, and evidence-based and tailored very much to the decision-making context that we do our work in. Now, if market information relating directly to an ecosystem service is not available, then we move to the middle group of boxes, the non-market valuation group. And these fall into two categories, revealed preference or stated preference. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of each of these. So revealed preference rely on parallel market transactions that relate indirectly to the service that's being valued. The most important and well-known of these approaches includes hedonic pricing and travel estimates. So the hedonic pricing method measures the value of services that should be reflected in market prices of nearby goods due to proximity to those services. So this method is most commonly used to value services that impact the pricing of housing real estate. So many of us know that if you own a home close to a park or a wetland, its value is higher. Okay, so determining the extent of property values and how they are affected by any given ecosystem service requires really an in-depth understanding of the many variables affecting a real estate market in a specific region, but probably a method that people have read about. The travel cost method, on the other hand, assumes that the value of an ecosystem service can be measured by the amount people are willing to spend to access it. So, for instance, the value of changes in the quality of a recreational site can be measured by the change in demand for people to travel to that site. So this method is really useful for calculating recreational values, and it's used quite a bit for that. It's typically survey-based, and it requires a fair level of effort for data collection. Moving over to the stated preference, if neither direct or indirect market information is available for an ecosystem service, then you need to create a hypothetical market. So the methods that take this approach are generally contingent valuation or choice modeling. They're based on survey responses, which try to estimate a person's willingness to pay for a good or a service. So stated preference models include, we'll rely on survey data to indicate someone's willingness to pay for a specific service, either by asking directly, which is contingent valuation. So how much do you value, a certain species maybe, or by asking people to choose between different trade-offs. So that might be, would you be willing to pay an extra, X amount in your taxes to see this beach restored? So these methods are widely used. They can be used for virtually any type of ecosystem service. They do have some limitations. Sometimes what people report they're willing to pay and what they're actually willing to pay can vary. So there's concerns about consistency and estimation. At the end of the day, you can get reliable results, but it really depends upon proper survey design, which really requires a professional with specific expertise in that area. And then the last group of methodologies fall in that box on the very right, benefit transfer. And this is a well-used approach. So this method involves applying values derived from primary studies to the same service, but in a different location. It requires much less time and resources, so you can assess many more services in a shorter period of time. It can be quite effective particularly when adjustments are made to the transferred site, really based upon some of the variables. So if you get a really good primary study that really kind of gives you the formula for how a calculation was made, and you're able to play with that, then it can be quite useful. At the end of the day, however, we generally say that, you know, it kind of gives you order of magnitude estimates. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through that. So I wanted to touch upon key considerations that should be made when you're choosing an approach. So the first and perhaps most important is, who is your audience? From whose viewpoint is this valuation being completed? So for instance, MNAI values services very specifically from the perspective of local governments. So understanding avoided infrastructure costs is relevant to that audience, because we're talking about costs that local governments are mandated to consider. That said, the same service can be viewed very differently from different groups. So to give you an example, 250 meters of a remnant stream in Oakville, we determined was providing between $1.2 and $1.4 million of service. That's from the perspective of the local government of Oakville. However, if you asked a community member what that value of the stream was, they might look at it and say, well, it's kind of degraded. It doesn't really support a significant amount of recreation. And so to us, you know, it might be worth significantly less. So really being aware of whose viewpoint you're representing, you can get very different results. Also, in terms of the audience category, it's really important to think about how the values are going to be used. What decisions are they going to inform? So if they're being factored, you know, for us with our values being factored into asset management, it really makes sense to use the avoided or the replacement cost, because this is what the Public Sector Accounting Board requires. However, if you're informing maybe changes to tax rates, then a contingent valuation, a survey of some sort, might be more appropriate. The second important consideration is how much time and how much money is available. Modeling can take anywhere from, say, 6 to 8 months for a fairly contained area, up to 2 years for a whole watershed, looking at a range of natural assets. So really thinking about that maybe versus benefit transfer, which can be completed in a number of months. So there's quite a difference there. And thinking about what services are going to be important to capture. So timeframe is an interesting one, because there's a huge difference in the way that societies measure time, which seems to be shrinking all the time, and the way nature measures time. So it's something to keep in mind as you're structuring your approach. Rob mentioned one of our findings, that the value of services generally increases over time. So when we complete scenario analysis to test future conditions, we found that under both climate change and intensified development scenarios, the value of natural assets increases. The other thing to note is that restoration takes time, and life cycle analysis can really help in kind of capturing that broader view and that longer time frame of the benefits of nature. And then lastly, you know, what additional benefits or co-benefits are you interested in? The same range of co-benefits are not always going to be present with every wetland. So really think what is important to capture in your community, and where there might be trade-offs. Promoting some services might imply less of other services. So if you're looking at a forest and you're managing it, for instance, for say maximum harvest rates, you might be trading off some biodiversity benefits. So really understanding that is important. Okay, there definitely are gaps in research needs. There's a lot I could say here, but I'm just going to focus on a couple. So the first is some services are really difficult to value. So for instance, health benefits and cultural benefits. I think the research that's coming out there is improving, but there's still a number of research needs related here. So I'll start with the health side. I think that many of us have realized this year, how important time in nature can be to our health. And there is really this growing body of literature regarding the health effects of access to nature for different social groups. Global reviews of the list of benefits seems to keep growing. So things like improvements to attention span, reduced mental fatigue, improved academic performance, improved cognitive function in children, improved productivity, assistance with reducing anxiety or depression. So there's this growing long list that we're seeing in the research. However, it's really difficult to capture the local context for health-related benefits of time in nature, as few studies exist at this scale. There are some. There's been a lot of work that looks at the role of nature in mitigating pollution. There's been a lot of work done looking at the role of nature in assisting with health outcomes. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I think, definitely it's an area that many groups, including MNAI, is interested in, but anything that you report is probably going to be partial. Cultural ecosystem services are also of a lot of interest to many groups. So these are the non-material benefits that people obtain from a natural environment. Things like spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, aesthetic inspiration, recreation, cultural identity, sense of place. These are the sorts of things that kind of fall into that category of cultural ecosystem services. Now, whereas once they were considered one class of ecosystem services alongside other categories like regulating services or provisioning services, it's now being proposed that cultural practices and cultural ecosystem services are closely linked and really act as the lens through which several other services derive meaning. So in short, it's proposed that managing cultural ecosystem services implies managing other ecosystem services. So the argument that this group of services are foundational to sustainability claims that positive experiences in nature and attachment to nature can foster capabilities, stewardship attitudes, and identities that are really tied to local environments. So for example, learning to fish in a healthy, intact wetland can not only develop the skills associated with being a competent fisher person, but it can also develop key social bonds, place attachment, knowledge of wetland characteristics, spiritual understanding, and a sense of place. So this set of services then acts as a catalyst for further exploration of the environment, and assuming the experiences and exploration is positive, then the development of a stewardship ethic. And I think for many of us who've worked in ENGOs, we've probably seen, this theme throughout ourselves and our colleagues. So this is, a great and an exciting discovery and can inform a lot of our work, but it raises the question of how to properly account for it. And, I unfortunately don't have any easy answers for anyone. So I'm just going to close with some other important pieces, because economic valuation on its own often isn't sufficient to lead to change. We need proof of concept. So certainly, this is one of the main tasks that MNAI is engaged in, but we need lots of other groups doing the same sort of things, so we can have kind of a chorus of people doing this. We need supporting policies. So for instance, I mentioned the Public Sector Accounting Board. At this time, they don't recognize inherited natural assets. They're looking to change that, but it's probably going to be many years before we see some of those changes. We need a range of funding mechanisms to support local governments doing this work. So yes, there are some new and great funds that the federal government is offering, but definitely groups like insurers are starting to look, like Swiss Re, at, can there be an insurance product in Canada to support nature-based solutions, primarily as a climate adaptation strategy. We need professional guidance and standards, and this is going to apply to a range of disciplines. To give you an example, we are working with the BC engineers and geoscientists to come up with the first standard for natural assets, engineering standard. And we need to recognize and work through what can sometimes be the very hard process of collaboration. I think this work really points to the truth that ecosystems don't adhere to political boundaries, and you are going to be impacted by actions upstream and downstream in your watershed. So as much as possible, local governments that share natural assets really need to collaborate on the management of those assets. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Alyssa, for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was amazing. I did see you speak at another webinar, and that was kind of one of the hints on why we should invite you. But you only had like 15 minutes. So I was like, yes, let's give her an hour. And this has been amazing. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this period of time. I'm actually going to hand it off to Cindy because I see that there's a couple questions in the Q&A and she can read them out for you.
Okay.
Sure. So first we have from Sarah. She has two questions. First one, do the natural features that you assess for municipalities have to be contained within the municipal boundaries, or can they be outside the boundary lines or expand across multiple land management agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question and a common question. They don't necessarily need to be within within local government boundaries or even owned by them. So the first project that we completed with Gibson's, White Tower Park, was actually Crown land. But they recognized that for a fairly minimal cost to them to manage that park for the stormwater benefits was worth it for them. We're also starting to work at the watershed scale, where of course natural assets cross boundaries, and exploring how different local governments and regional governments can work together.
Thank you so much. And second question from Sarah. Do you know what stream in the district of West Vancouver was assessed?
Oh, yeah, what was the name of that stream now? Yeah, it was right by the water, and Brothers, I think it was Brothers Creek. I could confirm that though, or you could, we do have all of our technical reports available on our website, which is MNAI.ca. But I think it was Brothers Creek.
Thank you so much. And question from Mark. He's from Bowen Island. My project is to create a possibly restored wetland to act as tertiary sewage treatment. And I'm still not sure this will work. My community's treatment plant is near the ocean, so it's an easy leap to value a wetland asset as having avoided damage market value. My question, if there is a monetary value to tertiary treatment, could a wetland be considered as having direct market value?
So yeah, wetlands have been used definitely for tertiary treatment. You generally see this used by industry more so than local governments, but it is a recognized acceptable practice, and it can be fairly straightforward to calculate, any costs associated with that, as well as potential additional benefits. So definitely there, some of the some practitioners are building these specifically to have a range of habitat benefits as well. Definitely the key piece though is just ensuring that the tertiary waste that's going into the wetland doesn't exceed its capacity to treat it.
Thank you so much. That's all I have for questions for now.
Great. I am going to give people another moment. I have 10:38 as my timing, just in case they have any questions for either Rob or Michelle. This is kind of your last chance type thing to ask any burning questions that you have. And just a reminder to everybody that we will be sending out a recording of this event to everybody. So you can follow up with the wealth of information that you learned today in this webinar. We'll just give everybody one more moment to ask any questions before I release you guys to the rest of your day. Again, I just want to thank Rob and Michelle so much for taking the time out of your, I'm assuming, busy schedules and busy work life to join us for this event. It's incredibly valuable. Michelle, I think you missed the beginning, but usually our Wetlands Institute is an intense 7-day hands-on experience. And because of COVID, we had to change it around a little bit, but the Wetland Institute speaker series has been so phenomenal. I was talking to Rob this morning and stating that we're able to get, experts in their field from all over British Columbia and even outside of BC and even outside of Canada if we wanted to, that we're going to continue it. So you might both be invited back next year.
Great. Well, one of the benefits of I guess, working from home, right, is you're able to join these. So, and great to see you again, Rob.
Great to see you too.
I think we have a few more questions here.
Yeah, so I have a question from Sarg. Are there any limits to how big a natural body be quantified or valued? And do your approaches change with size?
Yeah, they can change with size because generally, so there's not necessarily any limit, I would say. What the constraining feature is how much time it takes to set up the model. So generally, that's more, the watershed scale work can be just a little bit more time and labor intensive to set up the models, and the results that you get might be at a bit of a coarser scale, but no inherent limitation on size.
Thank you. Next question from Bonnie. Regarding stormwater, are improvements in contaminants concentrations considered?
Yeah, so we have looked at water filtration, and what we found was that wetlands, I believe it was, I'd have to go back to the Peel report. I don't think isolated wetlands were as effective as riverine or pole stream, but they were capable of filtering water and contaminants to provincial regulations. I'd also refer you to the Sparwood study, where they were really interested in filtering water before it went into the Elk River, because it had very important economic benefits just due to the amount of fishing and recreation that occurred there. And we were able to model the decrease in total suspended solids from the pond.
Thank you. Next question from Mark. Can you name anyone using wetlands as tertiary treatment, perhaps on a community-based level as opposed to industrial?
No communities that we've worked with, but I wouldn't say that that doesn't mean that there's not any using them as tertiary treatment. Yeah, I could certainly look into that and let you know if anyone comes up, Alyssa or Cindy, and then maybe you could share it with Mark.
For sure, thank you. And next question from Michael. Does your organization provide advice or support to wetland conservation efforts in the Gulf Islands, such as Gabriola?
Yeah, absolutely. We work with really a wide range of partners. So like Rob said, you know, Ducks Unlimited was really important. We often work with universities. Yeah, so I think we'd be happy to have a conversation. Just would want to make sure that any of our results are actually applicable to what you're trying to achieve. So be happy to chat with you further about that.
Thank you. And he also has a question. How can sorry, I can never pronounce this, ephemeral pools and streams be assessed to determine their value?
Ephemeral.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we generally we generally do use modeling. Most commonly, like I said, it's models like EPA SWIM, HECRES, Visual IMO, and you know, and certainly we've looked at streams and rivers and various types of wetlands.
Thank you. Next question. Which category of co-benefits would you say that education falls under? For example, the opportunity of teaching students about ecosystems through field trips to local wetlands.
Yeah, that generally falls under cultural services. And I would say that it's one example, education as well as recreation and tourism, which have been, you know, there are a number of existing studies and values, even, you know, Canadian specific, that can be assessed.
Thank you. And next question, would you see a benefit to municipalities charging a fee to all landowners to encourage retention of natural assets, and those that have wetlands or other natural assets get a break or don't have to pay the fee? It could let residents know that they are benefited by the rest of the community making decisions to retain wetlands, etc. And let residents know that do keep these assets healthy, their value.
Should probably turn it over to Rob to.
It's a good question. I think, hasn't it been something similar done in the Cowichan Valley? It's mostly about setting aside funds for park acquisition, of course, but it's something that was done through a referendum, as I recall. And I guess there's a tool to do that if that was an approach a community wanted to take. But again, there's always that sensitivity around increasing taxes and value for money that always has to be in the conversation, right? So that's kind of my thoughts on it. But it sounds like it's an interesting idea. So I think it's worth looking into.
Thank you so much. That's all I have for now.
I just had a quick question. Michelle, you said there's about 20 communities across Canada and a handful within BC proper that you've worked with. Do you know if these studies that you collaborated with these municipalities, are they available on their websites or would it be available to the public?
I'm not sure how many are available on their websites, but all of our studies are available on our website. So so that is MNAI.ca, and there's a tab for project communities, and you can find the studies there.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It looks like we just got one more question. So it's from Mark. Sorry to keep bringing up sewage. After secondary treatment, I believe the biggest contaminant is E. coli. Are there studies giving an idea of the levels of E. coli or wetland can sustainably accept and remove?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I'd be able to answer that fully. Now, certainly we are doing some work with conservation authorities in Ontario. So these are groups that are kind of like an arm's length government at the watershed scale. So almost like a regional level government. And they are, I believe all of them are monitoring E. coli as one of the indicators for ecosystem health. I'm not sure how effective wetlands are in limiting E. coli levels, but certainly I think conservation authorities would be a key person to reach out to ask about that.
I think it's thinking about that systems approach that maybe the wetland needs to be seen in context of an engineered facility that would do the primary cleaning, and the wetland kind of does the complements that and helps in that transition for the outflow to a natural water course. You don't necessarily see them in isolation, but maybe as part of a bigger system that deals with the flow, wherever the source is. I'm assuming it's a community.
Yeah, we've had Mark at a couple of our other webinars, and it is a community. I believe it's Bowen Island. And so what they're doing is they're looking into, because a lot of the islands, they just have primary treatment. So it kind of, goes through a grate and then into the ocean. So I think he's investigating how to implement natural services to help them do this service and, at a better effect than what's currently in place. So in previous conversations with Mark, he's trying to investigate constructed wetlands, natural wetlands that are doing this similar feature, like what needs to be put in place, kind of, using natural assets to help you do the job without building this really expensive gray infrastructure. So I think that's where his question is coming from.
Okay.
I'd also just like to add, definitely to Rob, having a primary treatment or even a secondary treatment prior to going into something like a constructed wetland. But I'd also like to add that, the biological values of different types of wetlands can be quite different depending on the biological functions that are happening. Is it aerobic? Is it anaerobic? Are we seeing ephemeral? Are we seeing it flood? Like, is it a marsh? Is it an open water? Is it a bog? Is it a fen? So those are really going to change kind of the chemical and the biological processes that are available at the wetland as well. And again, when we're talking about using a natural wetland for human purposes, how much are you going to displace those other biological effects, like providing habitat for amphibians or breeding ground for amphibians if we're dumping our stormwater into there. So you kind of got to do the trade-off analysis too. Can we use this natural wetland for our purposes, and how many of the other values that it's already providing are going to be diminished because of it? And that's where the constructed wetlands can often come in and help fill that gap. Using the way natural wetlands function by slowing down the water, using that settlement, using that aerobic and anaerobic conditions to help bind and adhere contaminants and chemically changing some things, use nature as a model, but not disrupting natural wetlands and all the other values that they have associated with them. So those are just some things to consider as well when you're looking to utilize wetlands for things like stormwater retention and using treatment for city waste.
And great points, and just kind of underscoring what you said earlier, also trying what you define as a natural asset that complements a city infrastructure. Like an ephemeral wetland may not be appropriate for a storm system because of the impact, the negative impact it would have on flows, and then the function of the ephemeral wetland and the life that kind of needs to survive within that environment. You're right. So maybe that's something you just accept that's not included in this. It needs to be kind of something that's complementary without impacting the overall ecological balance of the wetland itself. Fair point. And I think more research obviously needs to be done on that to clarify that.
Where we need more funding.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, that kind of touched to the question that Michael had follow up as well. He's regards to ephemeral pools. They're often viewed as the simply flooded areas without much practical value. They are important breeding areas for amphibians. So if there's any other argument he could use to advocate their value.
Yeah. Certainly they are providing hydrological benefits, but I think just being aware of what level of benefits and some of the trade-offs that Alyssa and Rob pointed to would be really important for framing your argument.
Just have one more question here. As a private landowner on a very small scale, 40 acres in Pemberton Valley, we have a possible area to develop for a small wetland. How can I find out more about developing this and seeing if it can be an eco asset too?
Well, maybe the private landowner within a community. I know this is something that communities are always struggling with. Rob, would you want to address that question?
Well, yeah, I guess it depends what's driving the request to include it as an asset. Is it the community wanting to kind of incorporate it, or is part of its overall infrastructure? I guess an individual can appreciate the wetland for what it is on your own property, but if you're thinking about seeing it as part of like maybe a septic system or something like that on the property itself, I think you need to be, well, certainly you'd have to kind of follow whatever the regulations and requirements are, but also have a closer look with someone with the expertise to kind of see how your wetland could complement whatever system you're contemplating or that you're thinking of attaching or connecting to the wetland. Maybe I'm going in the wrong direction to what your question's asking, but yeah, it's kind of a difficult thing without a little more information about what you're thinking about as far as defining and including the asset on your property.
I'm just looking at the question from Kim right now and just reviewing it. It appears in the question that she doesn't currently have a wetland on the property, but would like to develop one.
Okay.
So my suggestion would be to connect with a local nonprofit or even reach out to us, and we can discuss how we can help you do that. If there's not a wetland already on the landscape and you want to build one, then working with a local nonprofit or a larger nonprofit or even a land trust and figuring out what would be the scope of that, how can you include or make an artificial novel ecosystem somewhere that never used to be there. More often than not, if it's a farmland, it probably used to be a wetland anyways that was degraded, over 200 years ago. So it would really be a true restoration. But a lot of the time, there's no way to know if there used to be a wetland on that landscape because aerial photos don't go back that far. But if a wetland is an asset that you would like to include on your property for whatever reason, whether it be, you really would just want to see waterfowl come while you're having your morning coffee, or you want to contribute to replenishing the aquifer or managing flooding on your property, then those are all things that you can do on a small scale to, to incorporate a wetland on your property. Yeah, reach out to us. We do just, of note, we do have a laundry list of people that are wanting to work with us to build wetlands. And really where we're struggling is finding the financials to do so. We're usually able to do about 2, maybe 3 projects a year. And finding the money to do so is what's the inhibitor here, as well as the capacity. I mean, we're just one organization and we usually work with 2 wetland specialists. So I would recommend reaching out to a couple different land trusts, a couple different nonprofits, and see who can help you get that on your land. I'd also like to recommend that we have often had people come to our in-person Wetland Institute who are landowners and are looking to build a wetland on their property. So they come to the Wetland Institute as a training opportunity to learn how to do so. And then because you're an institute participant, we then have funding to support you through our grants to help you, potentially design that wetland, or we can contribute a day or 2 of an expert to come on your property and help design it. And then you can find the funding to actually build the wetland depending on the scale of it. So there are opportunities for local landowners and private landowners to put these back on their landscape. And then just one more thing that I'm thinking of right now, when you are a private landowner and you're looking to include something like a wetland onto your property, it's really important to look at something like a conservation covenant. So when you do decide to leave that property or sell it, then that wetland is conserved and somebody's not going to just fill it back in and put a farmer's field back on it. So there's a couple things to consider, but there's definitely organizations out there that can help private landowners. It's just the biggest inhibitor is the funding. Like, where is the money coming from to actually get an excavator in there and do the digging? But Kim, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. You can feel free to send me an email, or there might be other local nonprofits. I know Squamish River Watershed Society, which is not quite Pemberton, but it's closer than we are. Edith has done a ton of wetland work, and we're actually partnering with them again to help build a wetland next year. So they have a lot of wetland experience as well. I think there's one more question or a couple more questions, but we're at 10:59. Are you, Rob and Michelle, do you have one more moment to answer one or 2 more questions, or is your time up? Do you need to go?
I could stay for a couple more questions. Sure.
Oh, Rob, you're muted.
Unfortunately, I have to go, but
yes.
Yeah,
No problem.
Thanks so much, and I'll forward the link for the study.
Yes,
it is on the MNAI site as well, as I recall. So
yeah,
but I'll send it. So
great. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Cindy, I think we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. Yeah, so next I have from David, what about valuation of impacts and benefits to the indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interest in starting to capture this aspect. So with our watershed scale project in the Comox Valley, definitely one of the project partners was the Comox First Nation. And we'd be interested in, further exploring work with other First Nations in various communities. Of course, the way that they can approach natural assets, whether they're mandated to provide it to the communities or not, the situation varies from First Nation to First Nation. So I wouldn't want to make any sweeping claims, but we'd be absolutely interested in working with First Nations.
I'd also like to add to that, BCWF has partnered with the Lower Kootenay Band or the Yakanuki First Nation for the last 3 years, and we're probably going to be partnering with them for the next 3 years. So a lot of nations, you know, they have land guardian programs. So we've often done training programs with them to assess the health of wetlands within their traditional territories so they can better protect their natural assets. And some nations like Seike Dene, they have a environmental consulting company that they've created called Chucho Environmental, and they've been building their own wetlands and restoring their own wetlands. So I think it depends on the capacity of the nation, but most of the nations that we've worked with or that we've communicated with are interested in protecting the natural assets within their traditional territory. They're just learning how they can do that. So whether that's, you know, working with a nonprofit organization or a land trust or something like MNAI to do so, there are resources out there.
Thank you. It looks like I just have one more question. I don't think it's directly linked to the eco asset, but maybe it'll be good to just throw out there. It's from Rebecca. How do you manage for the presence of invasives, for example, Canada thistle in your wetlands, given that herbicide use is limited in wetland areas?
Maybe Alyssa, you might be ideal to answer that.
Yeah, so yeah, herbicide use is inhibited within, I think, 10 meters of a water boundary. When you're dealing, well, Canada thistle is interesting in that it's not a facultative nor an obligate species, so you probably won't see it much in the boundary of a wetland, so you should be able to use herbicide on that specific one. For other invasive species that, you know, are obligate species or facultative, then you're finding within the boundary of the wetland or the riparian areas, such as, you know, yellow flag iris or things like that. There have been, reed canary grass is one of them. There have been some studies, many studies done actually on manual suppression of it. I think the battle against invasive species is going to be an uphill one, and you're never going to get 100% eradication of an invasive. It's more managing it to the point where it's not overriding the native species, so you're able to promote vegetation biodiversity on site and therefore providing more habitat niches for a variety of wildlife. So anytime you're approaching invasive species management, you know, having the realistic knowledge that you're always going to have invasive species on your site. That's just where we're at right now, especially ones that are still being sold in gardening stores like Morning Glory or Ivy or anything like that. But I think the biggest thing is do the research to what techniques are already out there, and manual suppression, such as you know, covering them and smothering them for X amount of time with a tarp or sheets or cardboard or mulch, or manual removal during non-flowering seasons. Chopping down, removing the root systems. There's lots of studies out there to remove an invasive depending on the species. Herbicide use is just one way to do so. I think we're at time. I have 11:05, and Michelle has been gracious enough to stay for an extra few minutes. So thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today. I'm glad that we had you for a full hour. It's been very informative, and I look forward to going on your website and looking at those studies of some of those communities.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the invitation. Have a great day.
So much. Thanks. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Please check your inbox. We will be sending out a link for this recording within the next week or so. And if you have not done so, please check out our other Institute series. I'm just going to add the link quickly in the chat that you can check out. Sorry, just give me a moment here. All right, so here is a link. If you haven't already done so, please peruse the other webinars that we're hosting and sign up. And then there is also an evaluation form. This is the first year that we've done this virtually, so we appreciate any feedback. If you would take a few moments, and I think it's just 5 questions. This will also be sent in the email as well. If you can fill out that and provide us with feedback, we just want to know how we can host these webinars better. Yeah, so please join us for future Wetland Institute webinar series, and please provide us with feedback, and we hope to see you again in the future. Take care, everybody. Bye.